But those kinds of modest bipartisan legislative actions are unlikely to satisfy the demand of domestic green groups or the international calls for action. So the Biden administration, just like the Obama administration, will no doubt have to opt for regulatory approaches, as it has already begun to do. So in terms of regulatory approaches, we can start with executive orders to reverse the Trump regulatory rollbacks. The candidates, and some of these have already been undertaken, abound, but just three examples which are particularly important in terms of actually accomplishing something. One is to reinstate and surpass the Obama era CAFE standards. This is the corporate average fuel economy standards for motor vehicles. Another is to reinstate the Obama rule for methane leaking from wells and pipeline. And a third, which is to recalculate, going back to the Obama method and then beyond, the social cost of carbon, which is a number which is very important in regulatory impact analysis for all sorts of climate and other kinds of regulatory actions. But secondly, there are regulatory actions by agencies, and two examples here that are in the offing. One is at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The new chair, or the nominated chair, is very interested in disclosure requirements for climate risk, something we've seen in Europe. And at the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the CFTC, they've already carried out a study on the Market Risk Advisory Committee looking at climate policy and climate implications. There's also possible use of the Congressional Review Act to nullify rules, but this is very limited. The Trump administration used this to a small degree. The nullification has to be within 60 legislative days of the rule's original adoption, and Congress must authorize any new regulations. In other words, if you overrule a previous regulation through this, you can't simply put in place the version that you would like to see instead. Otherwise, you have to go back to the Congress. But there are challenges to these regulatory approaches, and this is where it gets even more difficult, because new rules under existing statutory authority require a notice and comment period, an extensive record, interagency consultation, and most importantly, are subject to litigation. And I want to point out that new regulations now in the Biden years are much more likely to be successfully challenged than during the Obama years. And that's because there are now 245 Trump-appointed federal judges. That's more than 25% of the total number of federal judges across the United States. And perhaps most important, because of the three conservative appointees from Mr. Trump to the Supreme Court. So there's now a 6-3 conservative majority. And it's not just any kind of conservative majority. It's one that favors literal reading of statutes, much less flexibility given to departments and agencies. In fact, there's a possibility that they will actually overrule, or at least modify, what's called the Chevron doctrine, which has been in place for decades, under which federal courts deferred to the agencies when Congress was not absolutely clear about what it wanted or had in mind in a statute, which it does regularly with statutes which are not sufficiently specific. So one striking example of this would be the question of whether carbon dioxide can be regulated under the parts of the Clean Air Act that were apparently intended for localized air pollution, which is what the Obama administration did, and the current administration may also seek to do. What about other possibilities? Well, since the transition, you may have heard about, if you follow the US press or if you know people in the new government, a lot of talk about a whole of government approach to climate change. And under this, all departments and agencies would consider the climate impacts of all of their actions, whether or not the actions had anything to do with climate. This could be the Department of Labor, the Department of Defense, any department of government. The question is, what is this really going to produce in terms of short-term emissions reductions or long-term decarbonizing the economy? And the reality is that we simply don't know. I mean, I think I'm less than cautiously optimistic. I am somewhat skeptical here. I think it's like you came to my house for a dinner party and you come into the kitchen to see where I have the instruments of cooking, to see how the dinner is going to be prepared. And you notice there's no stove, there's no refrigerator, there's no sink. I don't have the instruments that's necessary for cooking, but I say, don't worry, I'm doing a whole of house approach to making dinner. I've got a chef in every one of the bedrooms. Now, those chefs, of course, don't have the instruments, they don't have stoves, they don't have anything else, but I've got personnel that agree with me in every one of the bedrooms. That's my skepticism of the whole of government approach to climate change. But importantly, to be more positive, there are state level policies and actions that can be effective and have been effective. There are very important subnational policies in California and in the Northeast. And it may be that we will see what we were already seeing during the Trump years is a bottom-up implicit national policy evolving from the Democratic-leaning states. Now, if you look at a map of the Democratic-leaning states, the ones that voted essentially for Biden in the most recent election, or even look at the ones that voted for Mrs. Clinton in the previous, the 2016 election, you'll see it looks like a very small part geographically of the map of the United States, but it's more than half the US population, and it's even a greater share of economic activity and therefore of greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, my greatest source of optimism, and I am optimistic about the Biden administration in contrast with the Trump administration, is because of the personnel themselves, and because of the view of the administration from the very top on down. And that is the embracing of scientific and other expertise and evidence-based policy, whether that's for the best epidemiologists and infectious disease experts to define effective strategies for this terrible pandemic, or the best scientists, lawyers, and yes, even economists to design sound climate policies that can also be politically feasible. So with that, 2 words, thank you. And then to remind you that if you'd like to get more information on any of this, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, both of which I direct, my website, my blog, or by all means, follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to get my numbers up. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Stavins. And to any participants, feel free to go ahead and start tweeting at Professor Stavins as well and increase that Twitter engagement. Wonderful. Marianne, did you have any other concluding remarks before we move on to Ms. Tina Latif?
No, thank you very much, Professor Stavins. I was happy that you concluded on an optimistic note.
Wonderful. So next up, we have Ms. Tina Latif. Tina Latif was one of the lead negotiators for the Paris Climate Agreement. Her overarching career goal is positioning climate action as an economic opportunity, especially in parts of the world that historically or politically have not seen it as such. Her work focuses on shifting the narrative on climate change, transforming it from an ideological and altruistic issue to one that delivers jobs, economic growth, and business opportunities. Tina is originally from Melbourne, Australia, and began her career as a banking and finance lawyer at a leading Australian firm. She recently completed her Master of Public Administration at Harvard, graduating from the John F. Kennedy School of Government with a focus on enabling government executives toward innovation. Thank you so much for joining us here, Tina. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. It's so good to see you. Really nice to see you also, Professor Stavins, and to all of you. I think we're all celebrating the 1-year anniversary that we didn't want to celebrate, which is the continuation of COVID. So I particularly appreciate your efforts in still bringing us together and creating these platforms so we can stay connected, and hopefully sometime soon we can all be meeting in person. One of the things that I think is making me really, to continue the note of optimism from Professor Stavins's presentation. But one of the most important things that's happening in the climate dialogue now that makes me most optimistic for the Paris Agreement is the reframe of climate action as an opportunity. So Paris aims to get us to net zero emissions by 2050. And we know the need to move urgently towards this path in order to stop the heat waves, the fires, the hurricanes, the droughts, and each of those things that are increasing every year that'll cost us trillions of dollars in damage and lost productivity. But there's also a positive case for action, and one that recognizes that the Paris Agreement is really a call for structural change to the global economy. And we're seeing that narrative, I think, play out in different policy movements around the world. And what does this mean? So at the end of 2020, even before President Biden came into power, and we saw, the resurgence of the US essentially on the global climate file, the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, and South Africa had each pledged to reach net zero by 2050, or by 2060 in the case of China. We expect President Biden to also commit the US to net zero by April 22nd, when he hosts quite a major climate conference for world leaders. But the point here is that from an extremely small share in 2019, we're now in a situation where over 70% of the world's economy is under net zero pledges. And as Professor Stavins mentioned, there's a ton of work to be done, and it's not as easy as sort of making these announcements and signaling. But I think what it does signal is a new wave of investment and innovation like the world has never seen. And under this, I think it wouldn't be controversial to say that the hope is, there'll be winners who act early and losers who try and ignore this structural change. And I'd like to offer some thoughts, on what winning, if you will, looks like. And I think part of that is connected to what Professor Stavins was saying, but, we need to make the Paris Agreement and its goals relevant, not just to the highest levels of government, so not just to presidents and prime ministers, but it really has to be something that's talked about at all levels of government. And I do feel optimistic about the whole of government approach that President Biden is taking. And perhaps there are no ovens or fridges or cooking utensils in the kitchen, but at some point, if you do have a chef in every room, they will point out that you don't have those tools. So this whole of government approach, I think, is really important, because if you don't have decision makers across all sectors working on solutions and looking for the opportunities, we'll have untold value that's left on the table. And that, I think, cuts to the heart and the premise of the Paris Agreement and to nationally determined contributions. My view of Paris and what it's trying to do is, and the way it was negotiated, was to try to nudge governments and business to scan the horizon and think about where they need to be in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, so that they can remain competitive, so that they can offer good jobs to their citizens, and, in the terms of businesses, offer dividends to their shareholders. So in this sense, I think climate action is one of the most powerful economic planning tools, and we need each government and businesses to be asking themselves whether the choices and investments they're making make sense for a low carbon world, make sense for a net zero world. If an industry or a country has a large carbon footprint, is this going to be a sustainable provider for jobs and economic growth? This is the kind of future orientation that we need to mainstream across government and business planning. And it's this kind of climate action delivers benefits narrative that I think is really, really important. And there's one more point that I wanted to make, not because, actually that's not true, but particularly because it's International Women's Day. I think we also really need to talk about the disproportionate impact that climate change has on women, particularly women in the developing world, and particularly in humanitarian situations. When climate change meets natural disaster, women are often the first to be hit and the last to be helped. Women, quite shockingly, are 14 times more likely to die than men in a natural disaster. And in terms of post-crisis opportunities, girls in humanitarian situations are, I think, 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be taken out of school and to stay out of school than boys. So as we move into a world where we're not negotiating the Paris Agreement anymore, and we're not debating the existence of climate change, because no matter what anyone says, I do think that we're past the point of, does climate exist or whatever not. I think we've put that to bed. But as we move into a new era where the world's economy is committing to net zero, my hope is that women and women's empowerment are taken on board as serious policy levers in combating climate change. And maybe that's a question we can kind of talk about and dig into a little bit later. But the overall message from me, I think, climate change, of course, is disruptive, it's challenging, but it doesn't have to be an experience and a conversation only about hardship. And I think with the right mindset and the right partnerships and the right government leadership and political leadership, climate action can be and should be a path to a more prosperous future. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for those remarks, Tina. It's always great to hear from you, especially in this setting. I know you were just featured in the Women Power Conference this weekend as well. So thank you for also acknowledging the International Day of Women, or International Women's Day today. And next up, we have Natalie. So Miss Natalie Unterstell served as the head of sustainable development for the Brazilian presidency. Go ahead and just try to mute yourself if you haven't already. Thank you very much for that. So as I was saying, Ms. Natalie Unterstell served as the head of sustainable development for the Brazilian presidency and as Brazil's climate and forest negotiator at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for several years. She is the founder of multiple think tanks and policy advocacy groups focused on climate leadership. And she serves as an advisor to various initiatives, including as an appointed member to the Green Climate Fund's accreditation panel. In 2018, she was selected for the largest all-female expedition to Antarctica, where she reaffirmed her commitment to advance climate solutions. At Harvard, she was a Louis Bacon Environmental Leadership Fellow and received a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government. Thank you so much for joining us today, Natalie. I'll turn it over to you now.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to join the HACE community, Professor Stavins and Tina Latif today. Thank you for having me, Daniel and Marianne. Let me start by saying that I am also optimistic because I think the zeitgeist shifted profoundly after the Paris Agreement was adopted. Tina already brought up a few examples on this convergence around net zero targets by the mid-century. And I really see that far from being just words on paper or on screen, we are seeing that the Paris Agreement is having a real effect on the real economy. And that's clear, for instance, in the trade dimension. There is, for instance, a major trade deal between the European Union and the Mercosur being negotiated. Actually, it's ratification right now. And at the same time, this deal is currently blocked over concerns about potential risks to the Paris Agreement goals by a few parties. And also the European Green Deal adopted a year ago is also considering a carbon border adjustment that would put up carbon price on imports from outside the bloc. So we see convergence about net zero targets, connections between trade and climate. And at the same time, climate diplomacy has yet to catch the space of transformation that the real economy is undergoing right now. I don't know if you have heard of it or read it, But last week, the UNFCCC released the first stock-taking report on the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and I was appalled to learn that we are just 1% better than 5 years ago in terms of locking in emissions reductions by 2030. So far, only 2 of the 18 largest emitters, the UK and the EU, presented updated NDCs with increased ambition. A similar second report will be released prior to COP26 in November, and major emitters that have not yet updated their submissions or have not yet raised their ambition were called to do so as soon as possible. Clearly, we will need a better picture by November. And in my point of view, the critical mission right now is to get as many big players as possible, representing much of the world's emissions as possible, really on track. In this context, I see that the US rejoining Paris, the US re-entering this multilateral space once again is welcome and so very important. First, because the US is the largest contributor to the accumulated stock of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and it still accounts for more than 20% of annual emissions, if I'm not wrong. So we need the US acting on the transformation that will make possible to meet the Paris goals at scale, at speed. And as Professor Stavins already said before, this means going beyond the initial NDC, having a target for the mid-century that is equivalent to the EU's, Japan, even China, as Tina has mentioned as well. And I would like to add the dimension of climate finance. There is a lot of expectations that the Biden administration can be more generous with contributions to the Green Climate Fund or even the Global Environmental Facility replenishment, for instance. A second reason why the US rejoining Paris is so important globally is that it can potentially infuse more trust in multilateralism, which was very important in the pathway to Paris 5 years ago, and certainly would make a good difference now in terms of Paris Agreement's goals implementation. And thirdly, the US rejoining Paris can provide a powerful political leverage to push other countries in the right direction. And let me say something here about Trump's announcement on the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement in 2017. That certainly caused instability, mostly in terms of future expectations about the Paris Agreement, but also concretely set off a negative domino effect over some parties like Brazil, Australia, Mexico, that felt encouraged to temper their climate ambitions. Now, I think we are on the cusp of a positive domino effect. Japan, for instance, announced it a few days ago, its willingness to raise ambition after US. China has not yet said anything about its emissions during this decade, other than just the peak in the year 2030. But we know that both China and the US will need to raise the ambitions of their NDCs, and this is a rare opportunity to align perhaps their goals. There's India, which needs climate finance to advance, and Brazil, my country. You may know that it's a serious problem, what's going on in relation to deforestation here, vis-a-vis the Amazon rainforest. Unfortunately, we are at the worst level of deforestation rates of the past 12 years. And if we take deforestation too far, we are unfortunately at the risk of doing that. We cannot get it back. So Biden acknowledged that in the presidential debate as a candidate, even mentioning potential economic consequences to Brazil if President Bolsonaro does not deal properly with the task, and recently mandated the Treasury to come up with a specific plan to support Amazon countries in its first executive order. So there's a lot of expectations also around the bilateral and the regional cooperation with the US. That said, the new US targets, assuming there will be new ones, they will likely have an outsized impact on overall global ambition this year. And the world is following closely to see not whether, but actually how the US will step up to climate leadership during this critical decade. To finalize, we see through Biden's campaign, appointments, early actions, that there is genuine interest in this new approach to climate policy. But as Professor Stavins already mentioned, the US strategy to re-entry the Paris Agreement will be assessed in terms of ambition, credibility, and durability. As for the UNFCCC negotiations this year, just a final word. The first and foremost agenda is to increase ambition before COP26, because currently the NDCs do not solve the problem. And second, also loss and damage and other mechanisms for climate justice will need to be developed further. This is a very difficult topic, by the way. And finally, I think we are going to need to figure out how to do negotiations better, and I hope that the US can be helpful in relation to this point. It's just very slow, very difficult at the moment, and we will need to seek ways of meeting the needs of both the present and the future of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Before asking questions from the floor, Professor Stavins and Tina, would you like to react to, each other's presentations?
I can. I'd rather hear from Tina first.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate Natalie's comments and completely agree with her on a number of points. Actually, I won't list them all, but the last one I think deserves some merit with regards to the pace of climate negotiations. In my experience with the climate negotiations, I had this analogy that developed in my head. Natalie, you may have felt it or heard it as well, that climate negotiators are like really bad students that leave studying and preparing for the exam to the very last minute. So I've always had this theory that, especially when we're negotiating Paris, and people were requesting more time, I'm like, I kind of feel like we just need to get it to the end of the road where we get all the work done. I think in Lima, so a year before Paris, the negotiating text was, I don't know, over 380 pages. And we really nutted it out, I think, in the last 24 hours. But I would just say, again, just to echo also what Natalie said, someone who saw firsthand the power of American diplomacy, I'm extremely glad that it's back in full force. So yes, the world didn't stop moving. And I think in particular, as it relates to, the pledges that we saw, particularly on net zero, the world did move, but I don't think anyone can mobilize as much as the White House does. And let me say, within 1 month of President Biden appointing Secretary John Kerry as Special Envoy for Climate, governments all around the world took note. Several countries, including the UAE and China, reappointed their special envoys for climate, and putting in that post exceptionally powerful diplomats, which I think reflects how seriously countries are going to take this issue and see this issue being under President Biden. And as Natalie also said, countries, including my own home country of Australia and Brazil and Mexico, et cetera, even countries that were allies to America, I think did take the opportunity to hide behind President Trump, have now changed their tune. So Australia, I think, is very seriously and probably will consider, or will announce a net zero target really soon. So I think a lot of people were worried about whether or not American leadership was over, et cetera. And I would just say, at least in the climate space, I would say absolutely not. And I'm extremely happy and excited that Biden's come back into power, especially this year, especially in the year where we have COP26. And we need to raise up the momentum, as Natalie said. I think you're going to see a lot of big announcements from government that will come specifically from the lobbying that President Biden and the White House and the State Department will do. So welcome back, America, is what I'll say.
Professor Stavins, would you like to add?
Well, I can, but because of time, if you'd prefer to go ahead to the next step, that's fine with me.
Yes, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. But I see already a first question from Paolo Barreto. So Paolo Barreto, you can unmute your mic and ask the question to our speakers.
Hello, thank you. I'm Paulo, I'm speaking from Belém, Brazil. My question is related to what Natalie mentioned about the carbon border tax. If the US does not move as boldly as necessary, what would be the role of and impact of Europe moving boldly in terms of having a carbon border tax? Thanks.
Okay, who would like to answer this question?
I'll jump in on that. I think there are one of two things that will happen. Either the European Union will decide not to go forward with the carbon border adjustment, or if it does go forward with the carbon border adjustment, it will find a way, even if it's not fundamentally honest, to say that the Biden administration has demonstrated sufficient ambition and ability to achieve that ambition with domestic policies such that it is exempt from the border adjustment. I say that because I fervently believe that the European Union does not wish to shoot itself in the foot and to begin to separate the United States and Europe as they were during the previous 4 years.
Thank you, Professor Stavins. Mr. Joly, would you like to ask your question? I see a raise. You can unmute your mic, Mr. Carlos Joly.
It looks like their audio may not be connected. So Carlos, if you want to also put your question in the chat, or if you're on another device with audio, you can continue to unmute. Okay, Carlos, you can go ahead and try to put your question in the chat and we'll try to come back to it. Thank you for raising your hand.
Okay, we have a question of Andrea. What is the role of the private sector and what is the biggest impact they can make? So,
just going to answer incredibly simply. I don't know if our other two speakers will have anything to add. I think, of course, the private sector will play a role, and I think it's really wonderful that you're seeing a lot of particularly multilateral large corporations committing to net zero and various other targets, but I think nothing can come in the place of very strong policy signaling. So I think the private sector has a very big role to play. They are playing a big role, but to see the transformational stage change, we need policy direction.
So I absolutely agree with Tina. I'd like to take credit and say she learned well in my class, but I don't think it's because of my class. She's absolutely right that all this talk that we had during the previous 4 years of various, public-private partnerships or statements from corporations, that there are two things that companies can do, and both go along with exactly what Tina said. One is through their lobbying efforts, not to fight too hard against domestic climate policies. and the other is to comply with domestic climate policies. But it's up to the national governments typically, or in the case of the European Union, the regional governance, to put in place public policies that make a difference. And that's because climate change, greenhouse gases are an externality. It is typically not in the interest of private companies to reduce emissions beyond the degree that's required by law. That's the justification for governments, and that's why government action is required.
Great. Thank you very much, Tina and Professor Stavins. We have another question relating to environmental justice. And the question is, do the panelists have any examples of successful policy initiatives that have quantified the benefits of environmental justice-centered efforts? Natalie, would you like to take this question?
I'm not aware of any like quantitative exercise on the benefits of environmental justice. However, I think we have several policy experiments from the past decade that have taken environmental justice into account and that they have been very successful. I can mention one which I'm very familiar with, which was the Amazon Fund, created through a cooperation between Norway, Germany, and Brazil. It was about paying for results achieved in tackling deforestation, and that was massive. We are talking about a $1 billion US fund, and it was very much centered in providing readiness funds to indigenous peoples and traditional communities in the Amazon rainforest. It was super important. It was based on the principle of environmental justice, and there were several important benefits coming out of that. But other than that, on quantitative exercises, I'm really not aware of any specific one.
So there are two very important ways in which the Biden administration is seeking to pursue what's normally called environmental justice in terms of climate change policies. One is that the impacts that most affect disadvantaged communities in the United States from climate policy are not the benefits of climate change reduction. It is rather the benefits of reducing correlated localized air pollutants, particularly PM 2.5. And under the Obama administration, there was a regulatory action which divorced consideration of correlated pollutants when putting in place public policies. The Biden administration, by executive order, has already reinstated that. So that's on one side of what's very important in terms of the impacts. The other one is what gets referred to, at least in this country, as just transition. And that is when you're putting in place a climate policy, although there are lots of winners, there are inevitably also losers. If you're a coal miner, you're going to be a loser from an effective climate change policy. And there's a part of the United States in particular, which is our own little developing country within the richest country in the world, and that's in Appalachia, where there's a lot of deep shaft coal mining. The Biden administration has made a proposal, which I have not yet seen enacted, but have made a proposal for just transition of funding job retraining and other welfare payments to sectors of the economy that are particularly hurt by what are on net overall meritorious policies, such for climate change. There's precedent for this. We did it back in 1990 with the Clean Air Act amendments to reduce acid rain. At the same time, we put in place a policy to help high sulfur coal miners in Appalachia.
Thank you, Professor Stavins and Natalie, for your remarks regarding this very important topic. We have another question, which is more technical about companies using offset to comply with net zero. And the first question is, what mechanism do you think is likely to emerge from Glasgow, COP26, on Article 6 from Paris? So technical.
So I don't want to monopolize things, but I'm happy to talk about that. So there are two elements in Article 6 that we have to distinguish. One is in this regard. One is Article 6.2, the other is Article 6.4. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but that's the way it is. So one, Article 6.2 is a mechanism whereby countries of the world can cooperate in terms of their climate policies. This could be by linking two different policies in two different countries. It could be a performance standard and a cap and trade, two cap and trades, a carbon tax and a performance standard. There are lots of ways of doing it, and it's doing it through offset mechanisms in which there is an overall cap. So it's like international cap and trade system, but it's different. It's not the same as Article 17 in the Kyoto Protocol, God forbid. So that's one aspect, and that could be promising. The other aspect is Article 6.4. Now, I recognize, particularly thinking in terms of Natalie, that everyone in developing countries, particularly Brazil, are very interested in the clean development mechanism, or the clean development mechanism on steroids, being continued under 6.4. And there's a lot of merit to that, but it has to be very carefully designed. And the reason it has to be carefully designed is that offset programs, such as the Clean Development Mechanism did, have a particular problem. This is true of offset programs within the United States. We've had them. And that's the issue that in international spheres is referred to as additionality. That when an offset project is created, then I say, well, I was going to tear down that forest, but I'm not going to tear down the forest if you give me some money, right? And thereby you can offset some emissions reductions in your own country. The problem is maybe I wasn't going to tear down that forest. I just said that I was. Or I say I'm going to put in place a new green power plant that's going to use natural gas in terms of coal, but maybe I was going to do that otherwise. There's an economic incentive for every offset project to propose those projects that are most profitable. I would be an idiot if I didn't do that. Of course, you propose the most profitable projects and get some additional funding for those. If a project is put in place in an offset system and there's a trade that would have happened anyway, then we have a less emissions reductions, typically in that case in the industrialized world, they get off the hook, but we're not getting any net increase from the project, which means we have an increase in emissions. And that's the problem of additionality. I don't want to use that as a broad brush to say that every CDM trade was morally bankrupt or not effective. I don't think that's the case, nor that every possible route forward under Article 6.4 for a new international offset program that's carefully developed is not possible. An example is that in California, which has a very rigorous cap and trade system, they have 3 protocols, but only 3 for offsets. In fact, their protocols are probably too strict. They're probably keeping out offsets that would be credible. So you have to be very careful of which offsets are allowed. That's the end of my sermon.
Thank you. Natalie, would you like to react, or Tina?
I just want to add something, and I agree with professors' views on this. One dimension that is oftenly not considered is that we talk a lot about offsets. There's a lot of polemic discussions around it. But if we go to, for instance, the European ETS, 90% of what's traded there is in the form of allowances and other types of credits, not offsets. So offsets are just a small part of the whole system and the whole game. And I think the word is, and Professor, you are the expert here. I'm just a sort of observer of all of this. But I have the impression that the word is actually moving forward with more and more countries and jurisdictions adopting trade schemes and not necessarily, offset schemes. I think that's the main trend. And then you will have offsets even in the voluntary market that are going to be around the whole system. But that's not necessarily what's up for negotiations on Article 6. Article 6 doesn't, there is the corresponding adjustment piece of this, but I think the main issue there is how do you link this national jurisdictional systems to the international? How do you trade these international units? And then how do you guarantee that there will be no double counting? That's a major thing. And even like Brazil has had a historical classic position against, or in favor of carrying over credits from the Kyoto Protocol to Paris. But even here domestically now, there is a very hot debate around that. And most of the folks that I talk to, they want Brazil to change that position. So let's see what's going to happen at COP26. It's very unclear right now what the final outcome can be.
So Natalie made a very important point, namely that a cap and trade system is different from an offset or an emission reduction credit system. And you have to be very careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So there are problems about offset systems. The EU ETS is a cap and trade system, as is RGGI and the California system. The EU ETS allowed offsets under the CDM, principally from Brazil and China, but it's not allowing them essentially going forward. The other is the issue of double counting is extremely important under Article 6.2. The mechanisms are there if properly put in place to do it. And if you don't mind my saying so as an academic, I've written a lot about this over the last couple of years, 2 articles in Science Magazine and some in legal scholarly articles as well. Go to my website, search for the word link or linkage, and you'll see about our proposals for Article 6.2.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're right up on our time boundary of 10 a.m. Eastern time now. Thank you, Professor Stavins, Ms. Natalie Unterstell, and Ms. Tina Latif for joining us here today on the deep dive discussion of the US, the Paris Agreement, and all of the engaging conversation that we can have associated with this. Thank you all for your incredible work on climate action and for your socio-ecological endeavors. We thank you today. We also honor the essentially 1-year marker in the US when many more people had been significantly impacted by the pandemic. So we honor all of the lives tragically lost to the pandemic, as well as the lives who will still be, unfortunately, continue to be impacted with the lingering trauma and livelihood losses. We also honor and uplift all of the incredible achievements of women on today's International Women's Day. So thank you all so much. This event will be made in a follow-up email, so the recording and the slides. We want to thank you all, especially all of the participants who have joined, for your time this morning engaging on this topic. We are going to open some optional breakout rooms. I know we have exceeded our time boundary initially, but it was a really great discussion. So thank you all so much. If you do remain in about a minute or two, I'll go ahead and open some breakout rooms for anyone who would like to continue. But thank you again, Natalie, Tina, Professor Stavins, and everyone who joined today. Thank you all so much.